An exploding media bombshell. Huw Edwards, the face of the BBC, the face of BBC News, the guy that was, of course, there on election night, the Queen's funeral, the King's coronation. He has been named as the BBC presenter at the centre of sex, pics, and, of course, these are just allegations at this stage, first reported by the Sun newspaper on Friday. Let's get the reaction now from a political point of view from top commentator, also regular contributor to the Telegraph newspaper, Margaret Thatcher's former aide, flown in from Washington in the United States, Nile Gardiner. Niall, great to have you in the studio.
It's great to be here. Thanks very much, Mark.
And we're still processing the scale of this story. Huw Edwards, the biggest star on the network. This is a crisis. Yes,
it certainly is. I mean, what a shocking development this evening. And I think the damage to the image and reputation of the BBC is absolutely huge here. And so if all the allegations are indeed true, I think we are looking at the rotting heart of the BBC, actually. And I think there will be major long-term consequences as a result of this. And I think also there will be growing calls for an independent inquiry into exactly what happened here. So this looks like a real can of worms that's opening up a major scandal here, and I think immensely damaging to the image, the standing, the reputation of the BBC.
Indeed, if it was a television presenter that just hosted this series or that, perhaps a sports presenter or an entertainment host, a comedian, it would be damaging. But this is a guy that was front and centre of their current affairs coverage. I mean, you look at the pandemic, he was very much the face of, you know, all of the bad news we had around lockdowns, all the rest of it. One of the allegations, only an allegation at this stage, that he may have broken lockdown rules himself. So the organisation has got a major headache.
Yeah, I think so here. And these allegations are absolutely appalling. They're horrendous. And it really illustrates, I think, as well, if the BBC had not been upfront, honest about what's happening here, it represents a culture within the BBC, I think, that really needs to see the light of day here, because these allegations are extremely serious. And if the BBC did not act early enough in terms of revealing what was happening, then I think that that's an absolute disgrace in terms of how this has been handled by the management of the BBC. There should be consequences at the very top of the British Broadcasting Corporation with regard to how this has been handled, which is why I think we do need to see an independent inquiry. We can't just have the BBC investigating itself. That's utterly ridiculous. We need to see an independent inquiry into what's happening here.
Well, that's right, because the worry is that the broadcaster that we all pay for very expensively may not just have an issue with its procedures and the checks and balances in relation to allegations like this, but cultural too. I mean, some people are calling it a cover-up. I don't know if that's too strong.
Well, I think that it's outrageous, frankly, that the British taxpayer has to fund the BBC today. This will result in growing calls, I think, for the licence fee to be ended. Why in this day and age should you have a corporation that's actually funded by the taxpayer? I think for far too long the BBC has been hugely complacent here, and I think it's time for a new era in which actually the BBC has to pay its own way, like everybody else in the free market here. And so this will result in growing calls, I think, for the end of the licence fee, which is outdated. I think it's a ridiculous notion to keep that licence fee in this day and age. And I think this scandal, we're seeing also potentially just the tip of the iceberg here. And I think the BBC's handling of it has demonstrated a lack of transparency and accountability here. And the British taxpayer is actually having to fund all this.
Indeed. So, in your career and, of course, as a former advisor to Margaret Thatcher, you know a thing or two about leadership, and you mentioned the management of the BBC. I wonder whether the Director General, Tim Davie, is considering his position at this moment, or whether he should.
Well, he should be, because at the end of the day, he is ultimately responsible for what happens inside the BBC. And if there's been any failure of leadership within the management of the BBC, then the head of the BBC should go. It's as simple as that. It's a matter of accountability. It's a matter of the leadership taking responsibility for what has happened here.
Briefly, another nail in the coffin for the licence fee. If these allegations are in any way proven right, it undermines the mandate upon the public to pay all that money every year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of the taxpayer having to fund the BBC, it's fundamentally wrong. I think it's unfair as well to competitors to the BBC, and the licence fee belongs in another era, not in the modern era today, actually, in terms of a great deal of competition in the market, and the BBC needs to be held to account. The licence fee needs to be, I think, thrown out of the window.
Niall, thrilled to have you in the studio, and thank you for flying in from Washington to see us. Always great to have you on the channel.
Thanks.
Normally you're down the line.
Yes.
From your rather fancy Washington apartment, but we'll catch up soon. Great to see you face to face. Listen, in the spirit of balance, I should argue that the BBC would say that they have millions of very happy viewers and listeners who enjoy radio. They enjoy music, current affairs, drama, you name it, and that the BBC do a great job. And look, it's very important on this show and on this channel to offer a balance of views. Is the BBC still delivering for you? Mark@gbnews.com.